My pleasure now to introduce the first of those, Terry Lovat, Emeritus Professor and Postgraduate Theology Convener for the University of Newcastle and Senior Research Fellow, Philosophy, Religion and Education for the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom. Emeritus Professor Terry Lovat is here to discuss Reconciling the Abrahamic Traditions, lessons from Convivencia. Here is the first of our speakers, Emeritus Professor Terry Lovat.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, everyone. It would be, I think, fair to say that not everyone who claims to believe in an all-loving God who calls them to behave in the same way always acts as though that's what they believe. Followers of religions everywhere, along with the non-religious, share some of the worst reputations for hatefulness and violence towards fellow humans and indeed all living things. And when religion's involved in these things, it's often characterised as being inherently given to violence and to have done much harm to humanity, to other species, and indeed the planet itself. As Pope Francis has said this week, we have to join all of the dots. We can't just fill one of them in at a time. And it's in the spirit of that joining all the dots that I offer these thoughts today. Violence, after all, is the issue. Against whom, towards what, is secondary. Violence is the abuse. Violence is the aberration that we address today. Again, when religion's involved in this violence, some argue naturally that perhaps the solution would be to do away with religion. The imagine there's no heaven scenario, or as Richard Dawkins puts it, rather ineloquently, against all the damage that's so obvious, show me something that religion has contributed, and even I might believe. It's a widespread sentiment, and it puts all religious believers today on notice. A heavily secular populace and its media are unflinching in their critique of religious people and institutions when they fail in the honesty, care or benevolence test at home or abroad, and rightly so. Midst such critique, the preponderance of religious violence around the world today serves only to sharpen minds and pens against religion in general. For those with no pretension to believe, it becomes just another instance of the innate falsity, hypocrisy and delusion-ridden nature of religious belief. For those who do believe or are interested to believe, religion can come to seem, through its institutions, as something rather obstructive towards spirituality, rather than a pathway to it, as standing between and somehow blocking out God, rather than being a means of finding God. And certainly the Abrahamic faiths are not exempt from this scenario. Far from it. Indeed, a case could well be made for suggesting that they're the worst offenders of all, have been for 1,000 years at least, and may well be at one of their lowest points today in terms of the global strife and heartache wrought by their relationships within and between each other. When the sacred texts and traditions of these faiths seem to be drawn on by purported leaders and perpetrators of violence to justify dastardly deeds, then it seems their reputation as scourges rather than beneficent to humanity is sealed. What can we say to this when often the words that justify manifestly ungodly actions are direct quotes or citations from a tradition and there for all to see? It seems that the onus on those who claim to believe in the all-loving Abrahamic God, be they Jew, Christian, Muslim, or one of the other species of Abrahamic faith, are under more pressure than ever, not only to behave as though we believe so, but to justify our beliefs, including in terms of the same sacred texts and scholarly traditions that seem too easily able to be used to justify violent behaviour. We're under pains like never before to overtly and loudly reject all unjust violence done in the name of the God of Abraham, and to show that no sacred text, leader, or religious scholarship can ever authentically justify such behaviour. We need to have readily on our lips words like we find in Psalm 34, turn from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it. From the Gospel of John, chapter 14, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Or from Surah 21 of the Quran, we have not sent you except to be a provider of mercy and peace to all humankind. Moreover, we need to be able to show that those words that seem too easily able to be used to justify alternative behaviour, like, for instance, the words in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 10, do not think that I've come to bring peace to the world. I've not come to bring peace, but the sword. While apparently explicitly violent, and let's not be naive, it doesn't get to sound much more violent, and these are words that have been used to justify Christians taking up arms both against each other and against non-Christians, that these words are not as they seem, and that they can only be understood in the wider context of the overall beneficent purpose of the sacred text and the tradition that sits behind it. In other words, it's incumbent on believers across the Abrahamic faiths to be somewhat literate about their own sacred texts and traditions and each other's, so that individual words and phrases cannot be used to justify ungodly action and instead justify devilish behaviour. And indeed, in these terms, it's the Quran, although we could find texts from any of our traditions, it's the Quran that provides as good a warning against this delusion of mistaking Satan for God as we find in any of the texts. In Surah 17 we read, from God, Allah himself, and tell my servants that they should speak in a most kindly manner, even unto those who do not share their beliefs. Verily Satan is always ready to stir up discord between men, for verily Satan is man's foe. Hence we have not sent you with power to determine the faith of others. A clear Quranic mandate for religious tolerance and multi-faith acceptance. We see in this surah not only a general warning from God that believers can end up unwittingly doing the work of Satan, for Satan can so easily pose as God, and I'm not talking here about a reptilian creature with a pointy tail and pitchfork, but rather the disposition towards evil that we carry with us. But we see also a more specific warning about the most likely circumstances in which Satan will deceive people into thinking they're doing God's work when they're actually doing Satan's. The circumstances are those in which one is forcing one's belief onto others. When one is so convinced that only I or we are the true believers, the authentic people of God, the only chosen ones, the only ones who can be saved, that we feel justified in judging, persecuting, and if it comes to killing those who threaten this belief by holding to another one. And isn't this just the problem with the history of violence between and among the Abrahamic faiths? Aren't family squabbles the worst squabbles of all? The brother or sister who thinks only they are the rightful inheritor of the family goods. Isn't it a statistic that families fighting over property and estates is what keeps lawyers in business more than any other single thing? In our book, Reconciling Islam, Christianity and Judaism, my co-author Robert Crotty and I refer to the deeply ingrained disposition in each of the Abrahamic faiths of what we call the exclusivist trigger. A trigger that, when pulled by one or other of the faiths, makes peace impossible and violence almost inevitable. Be it in a particularly exclusivist and exclusionary interpretation among some Jews of what being the chosen people means and implies, among some Christians that there is no salvation outside the church, or among some Muslims that their claims on being the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise obliterates the rightful claims of the other siblings, each has potential to be as damaging as the other, and taking the warning from the Quran verse above to see Jews, Christians or Muslims doing the work of Satan rather than emulating the all-loving Abrahamic God they claim to worship. This truly is then siblings at war, and as suggested, these can be the worst wars of all. So what is the solution? That solution that continues to evade us 1,000 years on, and that sees so many of the world's most parlous spots, those most threatening to global peace, somehow associated with the Abrahamic sibling dispute. An element of the solution, I suggest, is pragmatic, quite common sense, and another theological. I'd like to speak to both and to use the examples of medieval Convivencia, which I'll explain as we go along, as illustrations in each case. So to the pragmatic. We must address situations that see populations of one or other of the faiths, or indeed anyone, enduring deprived and intolerable conditions. Where this is absent, the exclusivist trigger is too easily pulled as a kind of desperation measure to right a wrong, to effect a basic human justice. In this circumstance, religious exclusivism becomes a means of empowering the disempowered, a tool by which whole populations of alienated people can be militarized around an apparently just cause. The religious and theological overlay on the cause, preached by a charismatic cleric spouting from a holy book, becomes very coercive theatre for a vulnerable audience. The deplorable situation of human suffering and the promise of better things if the population follows the dictates seemingly justified by the sacred text are conjoined to give effect to a combined social and religious solution, namely justice in this world and salvation in the next, a tantalising and emotion-charged duo. When we explore the medieval historical event known as Convivencia, connoting long periods that saw Muslims, Christians and Jews living successfully together in the Al-Andalus region of Spain, even throughout the Crusades in some instances, we find that an essential feature was in the relative social equity and justice fabric of the cities, towns and regions in question. Care was taken to ensure that everyone, regardless of religious affiliation, had reasonable access to the goods of society, so assuring a necessary measure of social cohesion and stability. A settled population living reasonably well and fairly is an essential basis for any kind of religious harmony, and minimises the potential for the exclusivist trigger, even if pulled by the occasional fanatic, to take hold of great swathes of the population, such as we're seeing today. There are so many lessons in this for us today concerning so many of the world's most intransigent problem sites. So in their day, Palermo, Toledo and Cordoba all offer different examples of how convivencia worked, in some cases for the best part of 800 years. In each case, it happens that the Muslim population was dominant and invariably in control, either administratively or through its influence. Cordoba, as an example, was controlled by a succession of caliphates during this period. A couple of the most effective and wisest of caliphs or rulers were Abdul Rahman and his successor Al-Hakam, who together ruled for most of the decades of the 10th century or 4th century of the Muslim calendar. They were men of great learning and, for their times, great fairness. They employed the most modern forms of technology, including building and irrigation, to ensure there was both paid work for all and productivity to enjoy. The governance philosophy was to lead from the front and engage the population in the common task of material and cultural development, including the provision of education, welfare and healthcare for all. As a result, Cordoba became the largest and most civilised metropolis of its day, far ahead of anything that Northern Europe could boast at the time. It stands forever in time as a fortress of Abrahamic religious harmony, wherein the Muslim majority respected and supported the Jewish and Christian minorities, and in turn the Jewish and Christian populations worked cooperatively with their Muslim neighbours. Now, was this all sweetness and light? Were there never, across 800 years, any disruptions of greed, power-mongering, discrimination, exclusivism? Well, granted human nature, hardly. But the point remains that especially relative to the times, and these are times many hundreds of years before the European Enlightenment would even begin taking seriously the notion of human rights, social justice and fairness, these realities were being effected in these Abrahamic-dominated regimes. This is the pragmatic aspect of Convivencia, ensuring a stable social setting, something that still evades us today. So I turn to the theological element. Once stable polity is in place, it's possible to work through education and community effort to instill a level of shared values that becomes a kind of social glue that holds the population together. Among these values are explicitly religious ones. Combined with social stability, some level of shared values can serve as the cherry on the cake in staving off fanaticism, and because so much fanaticism is fueled by religion, sharing religious values is a particularly potent form of social glue. And again, we see this in the Convivencia polities where shared Abrahamic values became part of the social fabric that maintained stability. This was all around what was originally a Muslim conception of Jews, Christians and Muslims sharing a common heritage. The Muslim leadership declared Jews and Christians living in their regimes as being with them peoples of the book. Jews and Christians were accorded a status in these communities as what was called dhimmi peoples, effectively important minorities. Now again, there's been much written about this feature of Convivencia sites, some positive, others negative. It's another time not to be naively starry-eyed. Where humanity is concerned, nothing will be perfect. But what one has to remember is that around these times, anti-Semitism throughout Europe was rife, and many kings and church leaders in Northern Europe were lining up to attack and obliterate Muslim civilizations for little reason other than they were Muslim. In this context, the phenomenon and relative success of Convivencia looks pretty good. The concept of Jews and Christians as special people for Muslims was partly cultural but heavily theological. Culturally, Muslims recognised the importance of the other two religions in their own cultural development. But theologically, and perhaps more important, there was recognition that the three religions held the most important theological concept in common. That is, they shared the same God, along with many of the major stories that conveyed this God to the world. There is a particular importance about Islam in this respect, and it's something that Jews, Christians, and one dares to say most Muslims these days probably fail to see. Islam is the only one of the three religions that has a fully developed theology that incorporates the other two. And it was this theology and the sense of the inherent sibling relationship between the three traditions that underpinned these communities and so made Convivencia possible. Now, this is not to suggest that Convivencia relied solely on the fairly magnanimous Muslim leadership, though we might say it's worth us all recalling it, granted the times we live in and the stereotypes and prejudice that abounds about Islam today. But no, Convivencia also relied on the Jewish and Christian populations accepting the multicultural, multi-faith reality of their situation. In a word, all three religions had to put away any inclination to pull the exclusivist trigger that, let's face it, never sits too far from the surface in each of these traditions. Each of the religions truly did have to accept the legitimate claims of the other two, and especially around the belief that their own God was as much the God of the other two. The Abrahamic God, in other words, was in the end truly God of the world. Not a partial God, but a universal God. For those who truly understood the theological underpinnings of Convivencia, we might say their call was, let God be God. For God's sake, let God be God. One is reminded of one of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's lines, that God should never be seen as an object of religion, but as Lord of the world. Least of all can the Lord of the world become an object of any particular religion, the God who becomes a kind of CEO and patron of one of the forms of religion in competition with all the others. This is surely the God who is made in human image rather than the other way around. A tiny God, tiny of mind, tiny of purpose, constructed to bring solace to the insecure, to those who can't cope with living in a world characterised by difference of species, culture and belief. Can't cope, we might say, with living in God's world. When the tiny God of the insecure becomes the instrument and excuse for human cruelty to fellow humans and devastation of other species on the planet, then this tiny God is either the feeblest and most useless form of human construction, or it really has become a devil. I guess we could say we could excuse previous generations for worshipping such tiny gods. They had limited understanding of the extent of the universe and limited experience of difference. But for us, surely there is no excuse. We deal with difference every day in our cities and towns. Ours truly is a global world in every sense. Moreover, the sheer size and complexity of the world we live in must surely challenge lingering notions of tiny partial gods, gods who are not really God. It's less than 30 years since the excommunication of Galileo was overturned. Excommunicated for suggesting in the early 17th century that the sun, rather than the earth, was the centre of the universe. Just a few years later, Isaac Newton warned that Galileo was not only right in that respect, but he might well have understated the truth of the earth not being the centre. Maybe even the sun wasn't. Even then, this scientist-theologian could see that traditional images of the world, and indeed of God, would be challenged by the science that was inevitably to come. Now, in the lifetime of most of us, we've gone from limited understandings of the size and scope of the universe to knowing now that Galileo's world, basically our own solar system, is but one of 100 billion or so such solar systems in our own Milky Way galaxy. And moreover, that this Milky Way galaxy is just one of 100 billion or so galaxies, and astrophysicists are still counting, and some are now talking about 300, 400 billion. Some are talking about infinite, and some astrophysicists now argue that there may in fact be no centre, or if there is, we'll never know about it, because if the world is anything close to infinite, it makes no sense to speak of a centre. In this mind-blowing era of scientific facts about our universe, assuming we're talking about the God who truly is the God of the universe, and therefore the one who created and loves all of it, not just part of it, because that could hardly be God, the idea of a God who cares only about this planet, this tiny blue dot floating at the edge of the universe, as Carl Sagan describes it, and cares not about the rest. Nay, even a God who doesn't really care even about the whole blue dot, but only humanity on it. Nay, even a God who doesn't really care about all of humanity, but only some of it, who plays favourites and pits one lot of humanity against another lot, who justifies human cruelty to fellow humans and justifies trashing the planet itself. It's time to say, this is not God. This may well be Satan in disguise. It's time to say, I think, to those who choose to demean God in this way, please take your tiny God into the tiniest of rooms, lock the door, be content with your tiny God, who I think is a mischief and devil in disguise, and give those who believe in the God of the universe a chance. For God's sake, let God be God. Put away those satanic claims of exclusivity that divide us. Note the book of Ezekiel that warns so clearly those who take for granted their chosen status that God is more than capable of supplanting faithless shepherds with other shepherds to tend to his sheep. Note the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus warns those who rest on their Abrahamic laurels, any Abrahamic laurel, that God can raise children of Abraham from the rocks in the ground. Note and memorize Surah 53, "To you be your religion, and to me be mine," another Quranic charter for religious tolerance. And if we're still not convinced, particularly on the Islamic side, then let's take note of Abu Dawood's collection of hadith, where the Prophet himself is quoted as saying, "Beware, whoever is cruel and hard on a non-Muslim minority, or curtails their rights, or burdens them with more than they can bear, or takes anything from them against their will, I, Prophet Muhammad, will complain against that person on the day of judgment." Could anything be plainer? The testimony from the Abrahamic texts is clear. Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, our three most sacred characters, clearly believed in the God of the universe, no tiny God. And they knew their responsibilities, personal and social, before that God. Let those who purport to believe in and follow this Abrahamic faith emulate them and use this faith to make the world something that God can be proud rather than ashamed of, as must surely from time to time be the case now. For God's sake, let God be God. Thank you.
Welcome back as we continue this eConference from the Broken Bay Institute in Sydney, Australia. Of course, we are asking the question about violence or peace, the perspective coming up in terms of the sermon from Jesus on the Mount. But in the meantime, just reminding you, for those live viewers, that we are running some 20 minutes behind schedule. We will continue to persist with the schedule that we had, plus about 20 minutes. So we'll still have those breaks, we'll still have those opportunities for you to feed us back questions and perhaps even some pictures of where you are as part of this great international conference, and at the same time be able to discuss the various presentations about 20 minutes later than the original schedule.